Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for attending this webinar. The email engine is an extremely important component of any ITSM environment. The email engine notifies end users, customers, and staff of important changes to their tickets. Without these notifications, end users and customers would be frustrated with the lack of updates, and staff would not be alerted to updates, reassignments, requests for help, and so on. The email engine is also used to create tickets and to respond to approval requests. For many of our customers, the email engine is a critical component and must be reliable and resilient. We've noticed that a majority of the time that the email engine isn't working, it's caused by a misconfiguration. Misconfigurations of the mailboxes, either during initial setup or later on when your post office configuration changes. Today I'm going to show you some ideas on how to prevent configuration changes from causing problems, and I'll show you how to set up and validate email engine high availability. The agenda for today is to look at configuring for high availability, and we'll look at some specific failover use cases, and then we'll talk about safely configuring your mailboxes, and we'll look at ways to prevent problems from occurring. And lastly, we'll provide some references so that you can go and do some more research on your own. The email engine comes with two high availability features. First, for any post office host name, you can configure a backup post office host name. This allows the email engine to continue working even when a post office is down, as long as you have a live backup. Second, the email engine uses an AR system feature called Service Failover to ensure that even if one or more email engines or AR servers goes down, emails can keep flowing. So this is a diagram showing the physical layout of a typical email engine environment using these two features. The email engine is typically installed on the same host as an AR system server, but it can connect to any of your AR servers using a load balancer. This can help distribute your email engine load in the same way that you distribute your user traffic. And if for some reason the AR server becomes unavailable, the email engine will continue to work by connecting to an available AR server via the load balancer. Now this screen is a logical view of the same environment I just showed you. Email engines reside on an AR server host, but they have no real direct connection to that AR server since they can connect to any AR server via the load balancer. Each email engine is capable of handling multiple mailboxes. In this example that I'm showing, I have 3 mailboxes that are handled by 2 email engines. I have them distributed so that email engine 1 is handling a POP3 incoming mailbox and my first SMTP outgoing mailbox, while email engine 2 is handling my second SMTP mailbox. You can see by the ranking that if either one of these email engines goes down, the other will handle all 3 mailboxes. So with this layout, I get distribution of my workload as well as high availability. Since we're talking about keeping the email engines up and running, it's important to understand the areas of an email engine environment that are at potential risk. First, we have the email engine itself. Then we have the AR system servers. Next, we have number 3, the post office. Then the connection to the AR server, the network connection to the post office, and finally the service failover feature itself. Understanding the potential areas of risk, we're now going to look at some specific failure scenarios and then discuss how to prevent the email engine from suffering as a result. The first scenario we're going to look at is that an email engine stops working. It's possible that the email engine stopped working because of a resource issue on the box, maybe poor configuration. It's possible that you didn't configure it to connect through a load balancer, but it's connected directly to an AR server that's gone down. Or there's something else on the OS that for some reason caused the email engine to become unresponsive. The effect of that is that the email engine stops sending a heartbeat to the service failover feature. If the email engine stops sending a heartbeat, then that email engine will become inactive and won't be able to process emails. Any mailbox that was solely owned by that email engine won't process any emails. Next scenario is that an AR server stops working. And an AR server could stop working for a lot of different reasons. One is that there's a resource issue again. It could be that it's poor configuration, or there's something on the OS or the hardware that caused the service to stop. Well, the effect of an AR server not working is that the AR server itself stops sending a heartbeat and it becomes inactive as well. If an AR server stops working, then it won't respond to JMS messages, and other servers in the server group will start taking over any operations that it owned. Any email engines that were connected directly to this AR server will stop working and emails won't go through. Another scenario is that your post office stopped working. A possible cause is that there was some change made by IT or by the email administrators, and the email engines don't know how to connect anymore. It could be a network issue or any other issue that makes the post office unreachable or unable to be logged in. The effects of that are any email engine that was accessing that post office will fail to connect. Emails from all email engines are going to stop processing because they won't be able to connect to the post office. And the last use case is that the service failover feature is not working. And possible causes are that the service failover wasn't configured properly in the first place, such as maybe it wasn't ranked. Or it could be that you have ranked service failover, but the primary ranked server has failed, and you haven't ranked another server to be number 2. Another possible reason is that JMS messaging fails because of some reason like a networking issue, and the service failover operation is not owned by any server that's still up and running. And the effects of this is that the email engine ranking won't work properly because the service failover is in charge of telling an email engine whether it's active or inactive based on the ranking. No email engine will then be an active email engine server, and it won't process any emails. And if the service failover feature isn't working, then email engine failover won't work as well. So what can we do about all these scenarios? Well, the first thing is to properly configure the service failover. So how do you configure service failover? Well, the good news is that much of it is automatically configured. The first time an email engine starts up, it triggers the auto configuration by ranking itself to the next available rank for every enabled mailbox. What actually happens behind the scenes is that the email engine performs an AR create entry API call to the AR system service failover interface form. You may have never heard of this form, and there's a little bit of magic to this form. It's actually a display-only form that has some unique benefits. When this form is touched, AR server automatically creates or updates an entry in the AR system service failover whiteboard form. Now, the whiteboard form is used to monitor the health of each email engine. So since the email engine connected to the AR system server and performed an API call, AR server puts an entry into the whiteboard form to show that the email engine is currently up and running and healthy. Now, every minute, the service failover operation checks this form, and if it's the first time that this email engine has connected to any AR server in the environment, the service failover operation creates new entries in the ranking form for each mailbox and gives it a rank. So this automatic process is the email engine creating an entry into the interface form, AR server automatically detecting that entry and creating an entry in the whiteboard form, and then the service failover feature detecting that new entry and creating a ranking into the ranking form. It's possible that in your environment, you've never had to actually look at the whiteboard form or the ranking form because it just worked due to the auto configuration. But if you ever add or remove a mailbox after the initial configuration, you're going to need to manually remove or add ranking into the ranking form. Whether you're using the auto configuration or have configured manually, you should open up the AR system service failover ranking form and ensure that all your mailboxes are ranked properly. The auto configuration may have ranked it in maybe not the best way. So you should go into that form and check your ranking. You can also take this opportunity to do what I showed at the beginning of this presentation and distribute your mailboxes across multiple email engines. That may help with distributing the work. It also is going to help with your failover. Now that we've looked at how to make the email engine more resilient, let's look at how to get better fault tolerance with your post office. If the email engine cannot establish a connection to the post office, you can configure it so that it will try to connect to a backup post office. Now, this assumes that your email administrators have set up your post office with a backup. To use this feature, you simply need to create a failover server entry in the AR system email failover mail server configuration form. Each mail server can have only one failover server, but you can specify a failover server for each failover server. So that means your backup post office can have its own backup post office that you configure here. On the screen, I'm showing the data that I have in my own form. And you'll see that I have an SMTP host that I use for one of my Mailbox server names. And it has a backup host that I've called backup SMTP host. I also have a server for POP3 that I call POP3 host. And there's a backup for that one as well, which is backup POP3 host. Now you also notice that I have backups for my backups. I have another server that I've called backup SMTP host 2 that will be connected if my backup SMTP host isn't connectable. And the same with my POP3. I have a backup POP3 host 2 to connect to just in case my backup POP3 host doesn't work. So you can see how simple entries in this form can make it so that if you have any connection problems to your post office, you can set up alternatives pretty easily. So here's a flow chart of how the post office failover works. Each time the email engine tries to connect to a mailbox, any of your mailboxes, it will try to connect to the server that's configured in the mailbox configuration form. If that server is not available, then it will try to connect to the alternate server that's listed in the AR system email failover mail server configuration form. If that server isn't available, it will once again try to connect to the original server that was configured in the mailbox configuration form. And if that server is still not available, it will try to connect to the failover mail server. So this is the backup that I just mentioned. And the diagram on the right is in the documentation, and it shows you how this process works. But the point is that you can easily set up fault tolerance for your post office. We've looked at what features are available to set up some resiliency in the email engine, but the next step is to validate all of the settings that govern the email engine service failover. There are several forms and tables that you can look at to validate your configuration, but to make that task easier and to help you be more likely to perform this validation on a regular basis, we've added all the relevant information into the latest email engine test utility. You can find this utility by simply searching the BMC community for email engine diagnostics. It will pull up an article that has all the information about this utility, including the download of the utility, so you can start using it. Now, once you install and run this utility, you'll see this output that I have on my screen. It'll show that it collected the configuration information and that it tested your mailboxes. It'll also show the results of the tests on screen. The utility will also produce an output file called testutil.log. This log contains all the information you need to analyze your configurations, as well as the detailed information about your mailbox tests. When I open up the log file with the text editor, it looks something like this. I now want to look at the different sections of the log to show you how it could be useful for you to periodically inspect. The first section of the log shows the contents of the AR system service failover ranking form. It's important that you see the correct mailboxes with the correct server names with the correct ranking. And you need to inspect this for each of your mailboxes. For example, here I see that my outgoing SMTP mailbox is ranked number 1 on server remedy prod 2, and it's ranked number 2 on server remedy prod 1. This is what I intended, so now I'll continue checking the rest of my mailboxes. The next section in the log shows the contents of the AR system service failover whiteboard form. As I mentioned earlier, this form stores the health of your mailboxes. And with this output, I can see that my outgoing SMTP mailbox, which was ranked number 1 on server remedy prod 2, is actually unavailable on that server. That mailbox is actually active on the secondary server remedy prod 1. If I check that integer timestamp with an epic time converter, I see that the last heartbeat was Wednesday, July 27th of 2022. So that email engine hasn't been running for quite a while. Now this may lead me to go off and troubleshoot the email engine that is supposed to be running on remedy prod 2. Again, I'll want to check each mailbox so that I know if it's running and if it's running on the expected server. And if it's not, then I can lay out a plan to troubleshoot. The service failover operation must be ranked in the AR system server group operation ranking form. If it isn't, none of the email engines will become active. So it's also important to validate the ranking configuration. And this information is also included in the testutil.log file. The last section of the high availability information in the log file is the contents of the server group board table. This table shows the current ownership of all the server group operations. The operation that I'm most concerned with right now is Service Failover. From the last slide, I know that it was ranked number 1 on server remedy prod 1. And from this slide, I can see that it is in fact owned and running on remedy prod 1, which is good. So I hope you can see now the value of periodically running this new test utility and validating the configurations for high availability. Now I want to change focus and look at mailbox configurations. Mailbox configuration problems represent a very large percentage of the critical calls that BMC support gets on the email engine. And as it turns out, email engine represents a large percentage of the total critical calls that we get. So I want you to be able to make configuration changes without worrying about breaking the email engine. So you may be wondering why some customers are making so many changes. They should have configured correctly in the first place before they went live, right? Well, there's actually quite a few good reasons why you might find yourself making changes. Many customers find themselves being required to switch from a non-secure protocol to SSL, and then maybe later on switching to TLS. Customers that were using MAPI found themselves having to switch to another protocol. Some of them moved to EWS, and eventually some of those moved to EWS with OAuth 2. A more simple change that might happen quite often is the password change, and sometimes even a username change. I've highlighted some of the important fields to look at for a couple protocols when you are making changes. But whenever a change is made, and whatever that change happens to be, it's important that you make it safely. Just to bring to light how complex your changes might be, let's take a look at the EWS configuration using OAuth 2 authentication. Each of these fields must be entered exactly correct. So you can see it can get fairly complex when you're configuring your mailboxes, depending on which mailbox you're using. And as I stated in my example, some customers have to move to TLS for their email protocols. And it's not a trivial task to move to TLS, but it is a pretty common task. I've included an article in the reference section of this presentation if you need more information. That article shows that you need to update the Java ops for either the service on Windows or the startup script on Linux for the email engine. You need to set both the starttls.enable and the starttls.required to true for whichever protocols you're using. So that's an additional step that you have to take and make sure that it was done correctly. Now I want to talk about how to make those changes safely. Again, you can use the new email test utility. This utility will read your mailbox configuration information and perform a connectivity test for each of your mailboxes. You can run the utility to check all mailboxes, enabled mailboxes, or the disabled mailboxes. This gives you some options on how you test. For example, instead of immediately making changes to the existing mailbox that is working just fine currently, you can set up a new mailbox, disable it, and then run your test against disabled mailboxes first. This allows you to perform a test without risking your working environment. If your current mailbox is already not working, for example, perhaps the mail account password is already changed, and you're simply just updating the mailbox to provide the new password, you can perform the update to the password and then run the utility against your enabled mailboxes. The log will show that it performed the test, what values it used, and what the results were. It also has an option to show passwords in clear text. This is disabled by default, but does allow you to validate that the test was using the correct password if you like. The screen shows a successful test for an outgoing SMTP mailbox. Now let's look at what an incoming mailbox looks like. This is what the testutil.log shows for an incoming mailbox, this time using EWS for the protocol. It shows the information that it used, it shows that it successfully connected, and as proof that it actually logged in, it shows that it was able to retrieve the number of messages waiting in the inbox. If there was any error connecting, you'll get a useful error message. In this case, I improperly chose to use SSL, but I neglected to change the port to an SSL port. As you can see, I'm still using the non-secure port 110. The error message lets me know that there is something wrong with the SSL configuration for POP3, so that sends me in the right direction and I can start looking into that. In this EWS example, it failed as well, and you can see from the error that it is very specific to point out the problem is with the client secret. Many of the errors that you will get with this utility will be very clear and at a minimum will point you in the right direction. We just talked about all the different steps that you'll need to perform to prevent problems in your email engine environment. So let's review them one more time. Number one, plan for high availability. Configure your service failover with a secondary or even a tertiary email engine. Configure a failover post office. Next, test changes before you go live. Create test mailboxes that are disabled, provide all the information you need to simulate the live mailbox, and then perform a test before you modify the live mailbox. Lastly, run the new email engine test utility to check for any issues. So we highly recommend that you periodically run this utility for 3 reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, you need to validate your high availability setup. 2, you can test any changes that you're about to make before going live with them. And 3, you can test your current configurations to ensure that all your mailboxes are connecting correctly. If you perform all of these steps, you'll eliminate the most likely reasons that email engine has a problem in any ITSM environment. Since you're now ready to be proactive about preventing email engine issues, there's a couple other tools you might want to be aware of. First, we have the server group dashboard that sits on the AIR System Management Console. This comes out of the box with 2 email engine counters. If you keep an eye on the pending email messages number, you'll know pretty quickly if the email engine is not working or is simply not keeping up with the load. Also, the longest not sent email in days will tell you exactly how badly it isn't keeping up. That number represents the oldest email from all of your enabled mailboxes. In my case, the number is pretty high because I had set up a mailbox a long time ago and I never configured it correctly, but it's been sitting there with emails in it waiting to be sent. So this might be a good opportunity to do some cleanup. So these 2 counters should help you understand if the email engine is healthy. The last tool I'm going to mention is a free utility that is available from the BMC community called the Email Engine Throughput utility. You can find it by simply searching the community for Email Engine Throughput. This utility will analyze your email engine log and generate a CSV file that you can pull into Excel or any other tool that you want to see the rate at which your email engine is processing emails. In the image that I've shown in my test environment, you can see that I quickly threw together a chart. I just dumped the CSV file into Excel and created a chart to monitor my 4 outgoing mailboxes. You can do the same thing, just enable Finest Logging for your email engine and then let it collect the logs for a time frame that you want to analyze. Then just run the utility against that log. And it's a great way to see if your email engine processing rate is meeting your demands or your future demands. Quite often, customers will report that the email engine didn't work because some users didn't receive a notification. And it could just be that the email engine isn't keeping up. So maybe they will get that notification if they just wait a little longer. So this is a really nice utility just to show that maybe it is processing a lot of messages and you can see exactly what the rate is. That might help you troubleshoot the issue. Maybe you need to do some email engine tuning. So that's it for the content today. Here are some references that you can use to dig into any of the topics that I talked about today. The first link is the BMC documentation that talks about how to set up the failover server name for email engine. The second link is the documentation on setting up service failover for email engine. This is the entire high availability configuration for email. The next link is the best FAQ on AIR system email engine issues. The best FAQs are a great place to start. It has links to all the most common knowledge articles and other material. Next is the AIR system email engine throughput utility that I just mentioned. And lastly, I had mentioned the server group dashboard, and we had done a webinar that talks about how to customize that. So if you like that dashboard and you think you could use it to monitor some of the email engine stats, you can create your own flashboards and put on that dashboard. So in summary, I want you to know that the email engine can be configured to be fault tolerant, and you should configure it to be that way. You should also test configuration changes before you go live with them. Use the test utility, create a disabled mailbox that you can test, and then find out if these new settings work before you go live with them. Proactively monitoring the email engine can catch problems early and before your end users detect them. So it's really a good idea. So please visit the BMC community at community.bmc.com. And if you had a question today that didn't get answered, you can feel free to ask your question to the peer support channel on the communities. Well, thank you everybody for attending today.